My name is Sean McGeever, and I am a Young Life leader here in Phoenix, Arizona, and I also work with Young Life. And I have been going through the Gospel of John, and we are now on John chapter 6. So I'm going to give you a little overview of John chapter 6 and a couple other thoughts about doing a class, but none of it should replace your own reading of the Gospel of John or John chapter 6. And certainly you should be talking to those around you, leaders, your area director, friends, about what they see in the passage. But I'm going to tell you what I see, just in case it's helpful. And chapter 6 in John is an incredibly rich chapter. In fact, it has so many things that you could say in it that it's a bit problematic if you're just to try to turn to it and figure out what to do. There's 4 big sections. There's the first part, which is where Jesus talks about feeding 5,000. Then there's another part where Jesus walks on water. There's a third part where Jesus talks about being the bread of life. And then there's the fourth part where Jesus is deserted by many disciples. All of those could be incredible. I think the last two, where Jesus is the bread of life and Jesus is deserted, might be a bit richer and a little bit more, probably harder to explain and describe than what you would be able to do in most club talks. In fact, there's a very pivotal, controversial part in there about communion and this Eucharist and all that. So I don't know. I probably would avoid that, though. You might want to read through it in Campaign. There's incredible things there. But I'm going to say that I'd recommend you going through either Jesus feeds the 5,000s or 5,000 people, men. There's a lot more, obviously. Or Jesus walks on water. Now, if you're following along with John 2 and John 4, then in John 2, you already highlighted that Jesus turned the water into wine, so he has that sort of power. And then in John 4, you could have highlighted Jesus' interaction with the woman at the well, whereby he showed that he was both blind because he knew things about her that no one else would know, but he was also human because he was tired and thirsty. So if you had done those, of all the stories you could pick in chapter 6, I would go with where Jesus walks on water. So verses 16 through 24, though you could go in a lot of different directions. For what I'm going to describe here, I'm going to go with that. You can break that up into, I think, 5 different parts. There's the first part where the disciples get in the boat without Jesus and then they go across the lake. There's the second part where the wind and waves grow really rough and get crazy. And then there's a third part, which is miracle 1. There's actually 2 miracles in the story. Miracle 1 is where Jesus, even though the boat is in the middle of the lake, Jesus is walking on water. And so that's the first miracle. And in the midst of this miracle, the disciples are terrified, but then Jesus also talks to the disciples about their fear. So that's miracle number 1. Miracle number 2 is the fourth part where Jesus gets into the boat and they immediately arrive at their destination. It might be overlooked, or you might not notice that on the first reading, but they immediately show up at their destination. And since we know from some of the things I'm going to describe, and also from the other passages in Matthew and in Mark, it's not like the boat was already near the shore or something like that. He certainly was probably near the middle of the lake, and immediately they showed up on the shore. So that's the fourth part. The fifth part is that the the crowd tries to catch up to them in the boat. I probably wouldn't bring that into the talk too much. It's just kind of a associated part of the story. So that's what I would go with. Disciples get in the boat. 2, the wind grows wild. Then 3, miracle number 1, where Jesus is walking on water and calms their fears. And then miracle number 2, where Jesus helps them to immediately arrive where they were going. Here are a couple different main points you might want to consider. One is that Jesus helped his closest friends, the disciples, when they were terrified for their lives. So you can make a point about how Jesus is interested, eager, and capable of entering into terrifying parts of our lives and parts where we don't know what's happening. Another option could be for them to really focus on Jesus's word. It is me, do not be afraid. I see a club talk where you go through a whole bunch of different scenarios. Maybe even you think through those in the crowd, or even pray for God to give you some insight into those in the crowd. And you say, if your parents just broke up, Jesus' words are for you, it is me, do not be afraid. If don't know how the next year of school is going to go because of your grades, it is me. Do not be afraid. If you don't know if you're going to get into college, you don't know you're going to get into a team, if you don't know a crazy situation with someone who's close to you, it is me. Do not be afraid. Jesus wants to enter into that. So you could really drive that point home, Jesus's words. Another point would be that Jesus did things that humans can't do. He walked on water and he helped those in the boat arrive immediately in a miraculous way where they were going. So Jesus is God. You could just make a strong case for that. And then the last one is that Jesus took, the disciples took Jesus into their boat, and immediately they arrived. They did arrive. I'm putting in quotes because I want you to think a little bit maybe more figuratively also. They arrived where they needed to be. And will you take Jesus into your life? He might immediately arrive into your life in a way that you could have never expected. And so the idea of Jesus arriving into your life and stepping into it, and that when that happens, some things might happen immediately that you wouldn't have expected before. And to focus on the text, I mean, the thing that immediately helped them was he called fear. So a couple different main points you might be able to run with there. Here are a couple ideas about what this shows us about Jesus. Jesus, first off, he came to the disciples when they needed him. Second, Jesus calms their fears when they identified, he identified himself with "it is I." 3, Jesus is not a mere man. He is God, as he proved himself in 2 miracles in this story. What does this have to do with our life? Well, we all face situations where we fear. Everyone has fear, whether they admit it or not. So I think that's something that you could explore for your own self. Probably almost all Club Talks have some reflection on how this impacts our own lives. So you might stop and think right now, where do I have fear? Where am I struggling? Where do I want to run away from the situations that I'm in? You could think about that now, or you could also think about that in your past. So entering into the idea of fear. And then another idea of what this might have to do with our life would be that they were willing to take Jesus into their boat. And when they did, they arrived. So maybe if you're on the borderline about different areas of your life, whether it's to begin following him or to let him be in a difficult place in your life. Here are some relevant details, technical details. First off, anytime you run into a word, any word that you go, I think this is a bit of a churchy word or a Christianese word, I think you should translate it for him. So here's one, disciple. I always would just say his closest friends. So it uses that word in verse 16. Jesus' closest friends, more technically speaking, a follower, a learner, a apprentice of a master. But what I would go with is just be Jesus' closest friends. Another technical point, it talks in verse 17, it talks about that they set off across a lake for Capernaum. This lake is what we know as the Sea of Galilee. In other places, it's explained more specifically. And if you don't know, and I have these notes in here, but the lake was 600 feet below sea level. And with that being, there would be actually cool air that would come from a different part up above where and this still actually happens. And just the way that the cool air can come down into the warm air, it comes together in a really wild way. So that there's just, it could be very sudden changes of weather and of the wind and the waves coming up. And, we read about that in the Bible, and it has to do partially with the topography and the geography of the area. It also mentions in verse 19 that they had rowed the boat for 3 or 3.5 miles. So the Sea of Galilee is 12 miles wide and 7 miles long. So 12 miles by 7 miles. And it says that they had gone 3 or 3.5 miles. Now, we know it's a big lake and that they had gone for a while. We can look over in Mark chapter 6, verse 47, and it states that the boat was in the middle of the lake. So, you can map out where they were going when they were heading to Capernaum. Effectively, they're in the middle of this gigantic lake, which makes our point, or not our point, the point of Scripture, where they arrived immediately. They were most likely at least 3.5 miles away. To arrive immediately is a supernatural. So there's that. And then the last maybe technical point would be that when it says here they were terrified, but he said to them, "It is I, do not be afraid." The way that the wording is, it's literally that they feared, and Jesus said to them, "I am, do not fear." So being terrified and all that, it basically is saying, you guys are fearing, don't fear. The word for fear here is actually where we get the word for phobia. So if you think of, arachnophobia or any other sort of phobia, that's where we kind of currently have that word, but the word Greek for fear is based in the phobia. But it means just in lots of different ways to want to take flight or leave or be alarmed, to be terrified, all of the above. So here's a couple possible illustrations that you could do. If you could use a boat or a raft or even just blow up some sort of inflatable boat that you can buy at a store for pools and that sort of thing, I think that's awesome. Big, you can get in it. I've done a lot of talks from little boats that I've. So you could do that. You could do the talk from within the boat, but also the pivotal moment when they invite Jesus into the boat and then immediately something happens. That step when Jesus comes in, you can make a lot of. And if you actually have a boat or something that kind of symbolizes a boat, you could probably make that point even clearer. Another one that you could do would be the old sound track of the wind of the waves. So you could find some on YouTube. Maybe I'll try to dig it up. But I would start it really, really quiet. Maybe have another leader hit play or control the volume on it, and then just start turning up more and more. Go through the story and say, the wind was coming in. They're familiar with these guys were fishermen. They knew what to do, but it was getting a little wild, or it was getting crazy. What's going on out here 3.5 miles out here in the middle of this huge lake? And you just start raising your emotion, you're raising your energy, and meanwhile you're turning up the soundtrack more and more of crazy wind and waves coming together. That can really kind of bring them into the story. Last, and you'll have to just get creative on your own, is to explore the idea of fear. And you could talk maybe in a bit of a funny way, like, I always have had a fear of spiders or of clowns or something. Actually, clowns are pretty creepy. So you could think about it along that angle, kind of a silly, fun angle. Nothing wrong with that. Or you could go more on a personal and deep level of a real fear that you have or have been around. Maybe it's a fear of failure or a fear of issues with family, or maybe some other fear about your future or something like that. And when you do that, whenever you identify what other fear you want to do, whether it's kind of more of a silly one, a picture of a clown, which can be, bring it in there. Or maybe if it's about family or something like that, you could bring in a picture of your family and say, I just don't know, is my family going to be like this? Or just explore the idea of fear. And then you can deliver the good news of Jesus, which is, he says, "It is I, do not be afraid." And we step into that and say, Jesus, come into my world, come into my abode. And miracle number 2, that Jesus immediately can take us to our destination, is just a fantastic way to bring this story to life. So that's what I got. I hope that's a bit helpful. I will upload some of my notes, and a couple of you came in and out, but yeah, thanks for tuning in, and good luck on your talk.